All right.
Wait, we're taking notes.
You're taking notes, yeah. So you guys watched the video yesterday on the Depression, and it's pretty good. It kind of shows you exactly what's going on. When we talk about economic crises or economic depressions, they always have three things in common. Characteristics of these depressions are business failures, high unemployment, and falling prices. That's what you're going to find. You're going to find it in the Great Depression of the 1930s. You're going to find it in the Panic of 1893. And then, but you can go all the way back in time. But when we talk about the Great Depression, there's more to it than that. The Great Depression has numerous causes, and that's what I'm going to talk about briefly today. What we had in America at this point, number one, we had an uneven distribution of wealth. We had, the gap between the rich and the poor had grown substantially during the 1920s. We had gone through the 19-teens and into the 1920s. We were in this wartime production mode, where the more we make, the more money we can make. Well, once we get about halfway through the 20s, we have way too much stuff. We start building surpluses, and surpluses aren't going to make us any money. Speculation was a big problem during the 1920s. You had people, investing in land and stuff where they'd go and take loans out thinking the value of land was going to go up, and then property prices went down. You still owe that money that you took the loan out. So that was a problem. People started losing there. And then also, you have buying on the margin. During the 20s, stock prices started to soar. And a lot of people wanted to get in on the stock market, but they didn't have the cash on hand to go do it. Banks wouldn't loan you money to buy stocks, but stock companies would, stockbrokers would. So you could go in and they would say, hey, give us 10% of the value of the stock now, and when the stock goes up, you can pay us the rest. And then whatever's left over, that's your profit. Well, the problem is you have a lot of people who bought on margin, and then the stock prices dropped, and you still owed the original sum that you borrowed on. Shaky banking methods. We know how banks work. We know the different things they do. And normally you deposit your money into the bank. Then they use that money to loan to other people at a certain interest rate. And that interest rate is the profit for the bank. And it just keeps money flowing throughout our economy. Well, what a lot of banks did during the 1920s is they, too, started investing in stocks and bonds instead of investing in their depositors. And so when the stock market crashed, they lost everything, too. And then on top of that, that's the money they're supposed to have in the bank to pay their depositors back. And then finally, the government instituted more protective tariffs, trying to increase or sell off a lot of that surplus we have here. The problem is, what happened was a lot of the foreign countries started increasing their tariffs as well. And so that flow of trade between our country and the rest of the world basically slows down. Now, when you look at that list up there, not one thing caused the Depression. If just one thing had happened, we would have been fine. The problem is all of it happened at once. And so we created this economic perfect storm for failure. And that's what's going to happen in 1929. It's not the crash of the stock market that started the Depression. The stock market crashing was just kind of like the final step. It's that last thing that had to happen before everything went bad. Now, it wasn't the initial crash. There was actually two crashes a week apart. And the first crash, what you started seeing was investors and bankers and stuff, as the stock market prices started to drop, they started buying up stock. And then the more they bought, that kind of stabilized the prices. It kept them from dropping any further. But it only sustained the market for about a week. About a week later, the bottom fell out, all the values dropped, and no one could stop it from happening. And so we see the greatest loss in the stock market in history. Okay. Like I said, a lot of these banks had this shaky business ethics, the way they were working, and so they lost a lot of money too. And word gets out that the banks don't have any money. Yeah. And what happens is people start making runs on the bank, meaning I've got to get to the bank and get my money before the bank shuts its doors. Because once a bank closes its doors, or once it's out of money and they shut their doors, your money is gone. There's nothing to ensure that's going to be there. And if the banks have already given everything they have in the vault out, they're done. And you saw this all over the world, people just lining up, trying to get in and just trying to withdraw the cash out of the bank. How many of you guys have seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life? And at Christmas it's on. There's the one scene where, what's his face, George Bailey and his wife are getting ready to go on their honeymoon, and they see all these people run into the banks. That's the bank run, and he goes into his savings and loans. He has this huge crowd of all these people wanting to withdraw their money. And he knows, if I give out every single dollar, my doors are going to close and they're not going to reopen again. And so he negotiates with basically his stockholders. He said, can you just take out what you need, because I cannot, I can't close these doors. And they're like, well, no, I want my money. And they don't understand why their money's not there. And he explains to him, I used your money to loan him money to go build a house. And then I took the money he put in, and basically he said, all our money is out in loans. So I have to wait until I get paid back before I can give you your money. And what happens is, the people, because it's called It's a Wonderful Life, so it has to have a happy ending, they all agree just to take what they need, and at the end of the day, he has $2 left in the bank, which means, though, he could still stay open because they're still funded. Well, a lot of banks gave out all their money, and they had nothing, and those doors closed. Well, if you're one of those people at the end of the line, you didn't get your money and you lost everything. And we heard a story in the movie yesterday about the guy who saved for 40 years and had $1,000 in the bank, lost it all. Didn't have a dime left. So this is what people are facing. Now, it's not just people who have money in the banks, it's also businesses. And as businesses start to close, people start losing their jobs. And they can't afford to buy food for their families. And so one thing that happens during the Depression is you start seeing a lot of churches and other organizations start soup kitchens or bread banks and stuff like that. And people would actually have to go and, even today, if you don't have money, you can go down to different places and get a meal. This was common during the Depression. This picture right here on the left is probably one of the most famous pictures from the Depression. You have this billboard from the 1920s, when everything was great, saying, this is the world's highest standard of living, the American way, and you have a bread line right in front of that sign. And it's showing the irony of what's happened to our country. Like I said, a lot of people didn't have jobs at this point. And, literally sitting on corners, will work, do anything. There were stories of people who couldn't afford their kids. They couldn't afford to feed them. And instead of having their kids starve in front of them, they'd try to find them new homes, and they'd try to sell their kids. I don't know how many actually got sold. I was put up for sale, and I'm still with my family, so, it doesn't always happen. But, no. My mom's going to watch this, and she's going to be like, no. No, but it did happen. People were scared. They didn't know what to do. They were in a panic. Herbert Hoover and his reaction to this is what, a lot of people blame him for the extension of the Depression, because his first reaction was nothing. He said, he believed in the laissez-faire politics. He believed that the government shouldn't get involved in the economy, and he also believed that the government shouldn't give handouts. And that's when he said no direct relief. And direct relief basically means government payments. And he goes, no, I'm not going to do it. He tried to increase the tariff, although that failed. This was the Hawley-Smoot tariff. The whole purpose of that was trying to build up American enterprise, but it didn't work. And so he just kind of, he did some things towards the end of his term. He did pass some stuff for some relief. But what he's remembered is for no direct relief. He's remembered for the bonus army and what happened to them that we saw in the video yesterday. And so when it came time for the election, there was no doubt he wasn't going to win. His big idea, honestly, to deal with the Depression was the individual Americans. He basically said we're a strong lot of people, and because of that, we should be able to save ourselves. He brought up this idea of rugged individualism. And rugged individualism is that theme that we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. If we just buckle down, we can get through this together. But the American people had completely lost faith in him, and they just didn't believe anything he said at this point. That's going to lead us to the election of 1932. And this is when Hoover is seen as the victim of the Depression, where there's nothing he can do to survive. And FDR is seen as the savior. Now, they kind of talked about it in the movie, and it's kind of true. Literally, the one thing that FDR had going for him during this election that got him elected was the fact that his name was not Hoover. Seriously, they would have voted for anybody other than Hoover. So FDR comes in, and he says, I have a new deal for America. That's what he ran on, this idea of a new deal. The problem was, as he's running, saying, I'm going to give a new deal for America, he didn't know what that deal was yet. He didn't have a plan. However, as soon as he got elected, he got his closest advisors together. They're known as the Brain Trust, is what they were called. And they actually came up with what's known today as the New Deal. It was also after he was elected that they passed the 20th Amendment. This is just a side note. It used to be that when the president was elected, he would take office in March of the following year. Under FDR, they moved that up to January. That's why the president gets inaugurated in January now, on January 20th. Okay. When we look at FDR and the New Deal, basically what we see is we step away from the laissez-faire attitude of the government, and FDR takes on the idea that the government is responsible to make sure that our government or our economy runs smoothly. The big takeaway from the New Deal that you guys should have is that it increased the size and the power of our federal government. A lot of more power went to the executive, because as soon as FDR took office, he went to the Congress and says, we are in a status of crisis. I need to be able to act without having to go through the Congress for everything. And so they did grant him more power to make immediate decisions to deal with everything that was going wrong at the time. When we look at the New Deal, it's known as like the 3R plan. There was 3 R's that are part of his New Deal plan. The first thing he wanted to do was provide relief for the American people. They're struggling, they're suffering, so we need to provide some sort of immediate relief for them. Then he wants to recover, build a recovery system in our country. How can we climb up out of this economic depression? And then finally, once we get out, how do we protect ourselves from this happening again? So that's reform. So the 3 R's, relief, recovery, and reform. And what we're going to look at today primarily is the relief and what he did there. He got up on stage on his inauguration, and he realized that the American people are panicking. And he's got to find a way to bring a calm to the storm, if you will. And so he gives one of the most famous inaugural addresses, or one of the most famous lines that presidents have dealt in history, when he got up to the American people and said, it's going to be okay, because really the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And he basically reassured the people, said, I'm here with you, I'm going to get us through it, just have faith. He had to rebuild hope in America, because for most Americans, hope was lost. They didn't know, they didn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And so that was his job first, is to get hope back to the American people. The first thing he did was he reached out to them. He made himself available to the American people with his fireside chats. The idea was that he would be, people could sit by their radio at night, and he would, give them updates, talk to them about what the government's doing, give them, encourage them, and give them that hope they needed to hear. And in him addressing the American people instead of, other government officials, he personalized it for them. And people maybe could have started looking at him as a father figure, if you will, that FDR is going to come in and take care of us. He also sent his wife on a national tour. where she traveled throughout the country throughout his presidency. She would go speak on his behalf everywhere. And that also helped reassure people. When we get to the first 100 days, this is the first things he did. One of the very first things he passed was the Emergency Bank Act of 1933. And what this did was it put all banks on a 4-day holiday, basically shutting their doors. And during that time, bank inspectors went into the banks to make sure that they were fiscally sound, meaning they had enough money in their depository to take care of their customers. As soon as a bank inspector cleared a bank, they could reopen their doors. And when the public saw that the bank had reopened, they knew that the government had basically kind of gave it its seal of approval, that this bank is safe to use. They also passed the Glass-Steagall Act. This is what you probably know as the FDIC Act. And what the government did is they stepped in with all these banks that they guaranteed, and they said, we are going to ensure that your deposits up to $5,000 are safe. So there's not going to be any more stories about a guy who saves forever for 40 years, and then when the bank closes, he loses his $1,000. The government's telling us that even if the bank closes, your money is safe. Today, that number's up to $250,000, just for those of you who have a cool $250,000 just laying around. My $10 is safe. I know that. I'm good. Finally, he passed the Reconstruction Finance Corps. What this did was it got money out into circulation. Relief checks were given to about 15% of the Americans who were hurting the most, up to $200. They'd get a check from the government. And then they also sent $500 million to state welfare programs so the local governments could start dealing with people in their areas. So this was both a federal and a state effort to get money and get money circulating and get the economy moving again. He created the Civilian Conservation Corps. And basically this was just what we call today shovel-ready work. He's going to find jobs that don't require materials, don't require a lot of, infrastructure, if you will. It's just going to put people to work. And he had Americans going to work picking up trash along the highways, digging ditches, clearing forests, whatever they could do, where they could put a shovel in their hand and they said, okay, go earn your $5 a week or whatever it is. But he was putting Americans back to work. And that's what the Civilian Conservation Corps was about. The next one he passed was the CWA, or the Civil Works Administration. Now this one was more skilled labor, because what they started doing was building up America. They started building roads. They started building bridges. They would build hospitals. They'd build schools. They'd build libraries. And again, it was just a matter of getting men back to work. Are you guys familiar with Jefferson High School over in SAISD? Jefferson High School was built under the CWA. That gave a lot of jobs to people here in San Antonio. He also had a program where he hired artists, painters, writers, and craftsmen, if you will. That's why if you go over to Jefferson High School, look at some of the stonework on the building. They hired special craftsmen who could carve the stone to look at that. If you go into the auditorium or into the library, you can see the woodwork, and where they hired the special craftsmen to come in and use their skill, but still be employed. So, and then finally, he passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It's the last one I want to talk about today. This was to help the farmers. The farmers kind of got a double blow in all this. Not only did they lose all their money, they lost their land too, because a lot of people suffered under the Dust Bowl. And so what he did was those who still had land and still could grow food, he basically set up the Adjustment Act where the goal was to raise the price of crops by lowering production. Because remember, we had the surplus, we had the overproduction coming out of World War I. And so what basically he did is he started paying farmers not to farm. He said, if you have 50 acres to farm, you go ahead and farm 20. We'll give you a subsidy and pay you not to farm that other 30 acres. Now, there was two reasons for this. Number one, it slowed down production, and that's going to raise the price of the goods they're creating. And number two, it's also going to save the soil. Because one of the problems with the Dust Bowl is the ground, it had been over-farmed. There was no nutrients left, and so it just, when the storms came in, there was nothing to hold the soil together. So what they're doing is it's kind of starting almost like an idea of crop rotation. So you grow 20 acres over here. Next year you use this 20 acres over here. But we're going to pay you not to use the full 50 acres. Now, a lot of people are going to argue about the greatness of FDR. Some people say he's the greatest president ever. Others say, no, not so much. It just depends on how you look at it. A lot of people, I read an article in Forbes from 2009 that basically said some of the New Deal programs that are still in place today have a future expense to America of $50 trillion. Today, we're still paying for the New Deal. And so from that side of it, you're like, FDR got us into a world of hurt. But in the moment, if you're living there, there's the argument that FDR helped get us out of the Depression. He could have done it quicker, some people say. If he had invested more money up front, that could have almost stopped it, ended the Depression after a couple years, and probably could have prevented World War II. But that's all, what-if history. But he did step in, and like I said, he had to do something, and he reassured the Americans. I think for that, he deserves credit. Okay? There you go. That's all I got. Shut up.